Hello, hello. Welcome back. I'm Jackie. This is Clau, and we are joined by a special, fantastic, wonderful comrade. Clau, take it away.
Yes, please, peace, comrades. We have one of our wonderful comrades here, who, much like me, splits their time between the global South and the global North. I'm sure you experience, whiplash every time you come back. I always say that it's like going back in time because the struggles are so advanced in the global South, despite the poverty, despite all of this, right? But the struggles are so advanced that when you come back to the U.S., it just feels very disjointed. Did we
Mhm.
lose our guest just now?
Yeah, I think we lost her for a minute, and that's okay. We'll
Okay.
be right here, and they are back.
Okay, there we go.
All right.
I'm
uh,
so sorry about that.
no, no,
No,
no.
no worries.
Good. It's all good. So yeah, just maybe if you can introduce yourself, I'm sure folks can understand. I should probably do this too, but
Too
um,
late now.
yeah, it's too late now. My face and name are out there, but I'm sure folks can understand if you're in between narco dictators and U.S. imperialism. You kind of want to be a little bit, safe. So we're not,
Mhm.
we're going to be able to hear and enjoy the musings of our comrade. But yeah, if you want to introduce yourself, where you're at now, and maybe if you can start us off with the recent popular consultation in Ecuador, what those four questions were and the results.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me on the platform. I want to begin just by asking if my audio is okay. Do I sound clear? Okay, wonderful. Because if needed, I can plug in a mic. It's just I have a couple different ports going on here. But it sounds like it's all good, right?
Yep, all good. Sound great. Loud and clear.
Wonderful. Um, So yeah, thank you again for giving me and my comrades an opportunity. Yes, as you know, to share a little bit about both the general strike, the consequences of it, the wins, and the electoral victory that the Ecuadorian pueblo showed through a historic blow to U.S. imperialism a little bit over a week ago now. Um, and thank you also for protecting my anonymity. Folks can follow updates on via around the political landscape and the ongoing worker anti-imperialist struggle in Ecuador and across Latin America via my Twitter, Soviet Westazon, where I have been sharing and reporting, covering the paro nacional that just occurred in Ecuador, and the struggle which continues. Um, I am asking for anonymity just because I have also had some issues coming back from Cuba and China with the Customs and Border Patrol asking questions around political work. So thank you again for affording me that. But there are ways for folks to follow our work. I'm a member of a Latin American Marxist coalition that has supported and engaged with the Colombian general strike of 2021, and also with the Paro Nacionals, the general strikes of Ecuador. In both 2019 and 2022. Personally, my experiences with organizing anti-imperialist labor and land struggles, political prisoner campaigns, tenant union work, and undocumented worker struggles, and of course, solidarity with both Palestine and the anti-imperialist alliances across the Americas, which are so critical to the liberation of all working people. Um, I'm Ecuadorian. Come from a communist family in Ecuador that has Many of my elders have faced a repression. Some of them had to be given asylum by the Cuban Revolution because of the state repression in Ecuador that continues till today. So a lot of my reporting follows that, and particularly right now, to give an overview, as Clau asked, the last 6 months in Ecuador have been the most dangerous and deadly period in the nation's history. The results of a U.S. backed military regime, and no, that's not an, it's not an oxymoron. Although the U.S. likes to position itself as the opponent of the cartel economy, it is its biggest exporter and funder. And they have hijacked a once democratic socialist nation through the neoliberal privatization of the state, through the granting of blanket immunity to US soldiers operating within its borders, um, the revoking of our right to due process, a state of war decree under which 4 Black boys as young as 11 years old were kidnapped, tortured, shot, and then burned to death by 17 soldiers. The patrolling of our elections by Blackwater mercenaries, the defunding of healthcare, education, and indigenous protections, um, the exclusion of over 50% of the nation's workforce from its formal economy, IMF austerity measures, which actually laid off like around 5,000 public workers this summer. And then, of course, the proven collusion between multinational corporations and the cartel economy, including the president's own family, a billionaire company, which has, and all of this combined has caused the country to spiral from once the second safest in the nation to now the number one most dangerous, with the second highest rate of child hunger and 5 out of the world's 10 most dangerous cities. All of this is with the intention, of course, of creating a crisis so dire that it manufactures, public consent for a militarized U.S. puppet state. This has been continuously the playbook that the United States has used across Latin America. We see this in Plan Colombia. And of course, in the ongoing context right now, this manufacturing of public consent um, will in turn, of course, be used as a pawn for the growing war on Venezuela. And I'm very grateful to, be involved in the work that Clau is leading around and mobilizing around the Zona de Paz. And, we just had that week of action with solidarity, which I want to shout out. But yeah, then Senator, now U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirmed back in 2023 under the National Defense Authorization Act that Ecuador is its most strategic and pro-American partner in a sea of openly socialist nations who would help the United States develop resilience against state and non-state enemies, right? So that's very clear in what all of this repression is not just serving domestic interests, of the bourgeoisie and the compradors and U.S. imperialist nations within Ecuador, but very similar to how Colombia has been weaponized the past 20 years, or actually longer. Ecuador is also turning into a military pawn. But yeah, as Clau was saying, like this past week, or on the 16th, November 16th, Sunday, the Ecuadorian people, proved Marco Rubio wrong. They said, no, we will not be your most strategic, partner, after a month-long general strike that had started in September, led primarily by indigenous workers and campesinos, which shut down commerce routes and mining projects, major highways, and entire cities for over 30 days to protest this US-backed military regime. A popular referendum was put to a nationwide vote with 4 questions. These are the ones that Clau was referencing, um, and on which the country's sovereignty really hung. The questions were around whether to build a new U.S. military base after Ecuador successfully ousted them altogether in 2009 under a democratic socialist president. The second was whether to dissolve the constitution, which the Ecuadorian people ratified in the 2008 Montecristi Constitution. Um, whether to privatize elections by eliminating all public funding for campaigns, which makes the participation of working class candidates possible, right? And so Daniel Noboa, our current US backed puppet, and American citizen, I might add, he is like the OG Gusano because he's born and raised in Miami. And reports to them directly. He benefits from that, right? Because he's the son of the richest man in Ecuador. And so he can fund his own public campaign. Meanwhile, the indigenous presidential candidates, the working class presidential candidates need to rely on public funding, which he was seeking to eliminate. And finally, he also wanted to downsize our Congress to model a more American structure of government, again, reporting to his homeland of the United States. Um, but in response, millions of Ecuadorians delivered a historic blow, as I said, to US imperialism. They blocked each and every proposal by President Daniel Noboa. And even with the power of the State Department behind him, Ecuadorians, told him, the richest man in Ecuador, no, 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 right? Essentially, telling him, vete la verga, vende patria. Sorry, not to. I'm not sure if I can cuss on here, but I just want to,
Yes, please.
Word. But yeah, they sent him running. They literally, his first public appearance after this nationwide referendum was in the United States for a confidential meeting with Washington, right? And so he has, up until yesterday, had not provided a public appearance in Ecuador, making it very clear that that is who he reports to, not his constituency, right? And so, yeah, I'm in this moment, it's clear that he is once again, as he has multiple times in violating constitutional and international law, finding a way around respecting it and the word of the Ecuadorian people. But I still feel incredibly proud of my compas that even under a state of war decree that allows the army to raid and kidnap anyone they deem an enemy of the state, uh, even after there's been, over 30 confirmed cases, I think actually now 43 by of political disappearances, as even documented by Amnesty International, which I think most organizers know, tends to favor U.S. imperialist agendas sometimes. And so the fact that they even are confirming this shows how dire of a situation, Um, even after the military murdered three of our comrades at the general strike, even after they seized the bank accounts of the indigenous activists leading the strike, even after they censored and suspended TV channels for covering our strike, citing them as collaborators of terrorists and national security threat, because again, under this state of war decree, they can deem anyone who's an enemy of the state a terrorist and revoke their constitutional rights. Even after hundreds of prisoners have been massacred, even after they burned our children to death, right? Even after they had Eric Prince and his mercenary goons, formerly of Blackwater. I'm not sure what PR name they're spinning it with now, but they had him posted up to intimidate voters at the last election. And yet, with all of this pressure and repression, the Ecuadorian people still did not kneel to Daniel Noboa. And so I just have a lot of gratitude for my compas and what they mobilized. And I just, want to end by giving gratitude to Rosa Elena Paqui, Efrain Fuertes, and Jose Guaman, indigenous leaders who gave their life to this struggle during the general strike when they shouldn't have had to. This progress, this victory in a long struggle is for them and because of them.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that sort of deep background. I wonder also, I guess, with this blow, right, to the plans that Noboa had. What do you even though this was a victory for the people at the electoral site, right? What do you think comes next? Because I'm sure, being under state of emergency in early last year, January 2024, much like Peru, And I wonder, this would be a very interesting compare and contrast, right? Because I see a lot of similarities, especially when Noboa um, declares an internal armed war, right? So in the 80s, Peru was under an internal armed war that the numbers, very low numbers, are at least 70,000 killed. And to this day, we're still finding unmarked graves, right? Which really was like a Plan Condor, right? Like a truly an anti-communist purge. So I wonder, even though the Ecuadorian people did give Noboa and the U.S. a blow at the election site, what does come next? Because I think we understand that folks like this are not just going to go away and okay, well, we do respect democracy. I guess we're just going to pack it up, right?
No, absolutely. The material conditions on the ground, unfortunately, have not changed. Noboa is still in power. There is still a state of forces agreement between the U.S. State Department and the Ecuadorian government, which allows the U.S. military to not only occupy our airspace, our highways, our commerce routes, what else? Our maritime, like our ocean and coast. Which unfortunately could be used if this growing war on Venezuela escalates even further. Um, and then also there's the natural resource industries, which were previously nationalized, and or many of whom were previously nationalized have now been handed back to the hands of U.S. capitalists. And on top of that, daily life for Ecuadorians is incredibly dire. And as I mentioned, we are the nation with the second highest rate of child hunger. We are one of the most dangerous countries in all of the Americas, and that 90,000, that those conditions have displaced internally over 90,000 Ecuadorians, and furthermore created a huge wave of migration to the United States, wherein many undocumented migrants have to weather a very unsafe trip, crossing the hawkish U.S. military border. Um, and particularly under this escalation of mass deportations, are facing incredibly dire working conditions when they arrive to the United States. And so um, and in back home, the diesel subsidy, which was slashed, which is what really was the final straw that broke the camel's back and initiated this last general strike. Unfortunately, it remains. Of course, this general strike led to the Consulta Popular, and that is in representation of where the Ecuadorian pueblo, the people, stand. But unfortunately, it was called off, much to the dismay and in opposition to what the rank and file worker groups on the ground had decided. They wanted to continue, but the leadership struck a deal essentially behind their back with the Noboa administration, out of the fear, understandable fear, of the U.S. backed military regime, but certainly not a way to respond to the escalation of a dictatorship, really. And so this has also, of course, taken the highest toll on rural people, Black and Indigenous groups. The working class, and also children. We have had a 640% raise in child murder. The cases of missing people has I think it's doubled or tripled, and young girls as young as 12 years old account for more than 70% of those missing cases. And so it's clear that there is a coordinated effort that the state is allowing to happen either negligently, or I would argue is directly complicit in. Many of these girls are suspected to have been trafficked by the cartel, which I would love to touch on the ties it has to Noboa's family. Because poor working class families in areas where these cartels have seized the economy, have no choice but to, be intimidated into, letting these cartels essentially kidnap their children. And the still taxes were raised on working class people from 12 to 15%, despite Noboa's own family owing the government $98 million in tax debt. And these austerity measures of raising taxes, of slashing the diesel subsidy, are of course part of the IMF's impositions on the country. And particularly, I want to note that the IMF austerity measures, one of them was to close the Ministry of Security. I believe that's how you translate it to English, and like the Ministry of Justice, and it was handed over to the Ecuadorian military, and then also to the to exported to these American mercenary companies like Blackwater, right? And so the U.S. claims to want to like build security in these regions, but it's very clear that by closing these governments, agencies, that's not their interest. In reality, they really want our country unsafe, so that they can then say you need to be under a state of war, an internal war, and that we need a militarized state to keep people safe. And it's very clear that under Noboa, nothing has become safer. And actually, now Ecuador, under him, has become the number one exporter of cocaine. And 70% of the cocaine distribution passes through Ecuador and goes to Europe and the United States. And so everything that he claims to stand against, he's actually complicit in. And part of that is all leading to the U.S., having unlimited power to operate within our borders, including in the Galapagos, where they are still building a military base. And so, yeah, I just, the material conditions have not changed, and that's why, la lucha sigue. But certainly, I think that this general strike shows that there will be a more militant response as they continue to escalate.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Jackie, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I am listening to the horrific material conditions that the people are having to navigate just for daily life, but they're also organizing and resisting in just an incredible way. And I hear Clau say all of the time that the struggle is advanced in the global South. What does that mean for you? How would you explain that to us outside of the global South as a way to guide us to how we should orient ourselves in our organizing to be more effective here? I think. What would you tell us about how our organizing can be more effective given the conditions that you all are organizing in? And as bad as things are here, it's nothing close to that. Or maybe we don't think it is. What would you say to us?
No, yeah, that's such an important question to explore. And I won't claim to have all the answers, but I, one, I just want to say, because I have also, also organized in the United States, and I think it's really important sometimes the Americans, I'll hear them exceptionalize the state repression that they're under as an excuse for why they cannot arm a militant labor movement, a militant rebellion against the state. And I just want to say, as Clau pointed out, there have been mass scale purges and killings in Latin America, but not just there, in Indonesia, in the Arab regions, in Africa. And so you all are not alone, right? When I'm speaking to Americans, they're not alone, and that is unfortunately one of the risks of organizing. But Latin America has seen, right, in Argentina, under the quote unquote dirty war, which is a U.S. backed junta in which they killed, over 30,000 leftists. Many of them, actually, I like to like plug this, is many of them were Jewish communists, and guess who helped them massacre those people? The Israeli occupational forces, right? They sent over $1 billion in military aid. So as this ongoing genocide of Palestinian people continues to be, justified as a way to protect Jewish Americans, I don't think that like that should be the focus, right? The focus should always be on Palestinians, but I also think that it is incredibly ironic that the IDF claims this when they have been complicit in that. But sorry, to circle back, there's just there is, and we are not only under the repression of a police state, right, that is backed by our own nation's capitalist compradors, but also by U.S. military intervention and far less international observers, far less media attention. I imagine that most, I have looked and looked for international media covering the repression of the Noboa state, and it's very limited. Whereas when there is repression within the United States, even though bourgeois media often justifies it, there is still coverage. And so, I just want to say first, like the conditions, I don't think that's a fair excuse. One of the things that I think is so effective about the organizing in Latin America is people organizing around the points of production. So, for example, oil fields were shut down entirely by the collaboration between the indigenous campesinos whose land is being stolen from them to exploit for these oil extraction, but also the workers itself who see a shared interest with these indigenous people because they're being exploited by the same corporations in very different ways. Commerce routes, right? Like when Noboa first launched this diesel subsidy, the slashing of the diesel subsidy would make it far harder for the transportation of medical supplies, the transportation of food, the transportation of all these basic necessities, right? The response wasn't just to go to these points of like public office and protest, which is often what I see the strategy used in the United States, and that's important, right? Like you want to make your voice heard, but they were like, where do we actually wield power? And it's that these bourgeois systems rely on our labor to create their capital, to create their profit. And so if we say no, absolutely not, we will not, contribute to your profits unless you meet our demands. That is what has made the 2019 and the 2022 general strike in Ecuador possible, right? People shutting down commerce routes, people in the indigenous leaders in Otavalo, this past general strike, they gave a beautiful, inspiring speech where they said to their people, Otavalo is a historically indigenous a pueblo in Ecuador, and they said, nothing in the economy moves. Everything is put to a halt except for pharmacies and hospitals. The only things that keep people alive, that's the only thing that gets to run. Everything else, banks, taxis, grocery stores, everything else that moves capital is shut down, transportation. And so they joined arms with the truck drivers, with union workers, with the educators, with the students. And that's where the power is. And this is not just, it is not just spontaneous. There goes a lot of work into these strikes, right? The creation of mutual aid networks that can sustain people's livelihood during the strike because, they're withholding their employment. The coordination of security, the way that different organizations like El Movimiento Indígena y Campesina del Cotopaxi is, they're in the north, they're coordinating with the south. I'm like, I'm joining like weekly national meetings in which people are sharing their strategies. There's consistent communication, there's consistent self-criticism as well and self-reflection. Every time there's an action, people are like, what were the victories? What were the areas where we were weak? What are the ways that we can improve? Looking to history for lessons. And and also voicing disagreement when they feel that the leadership of these organizations is not fairly representing them, right? The CONAI, which is the largest indigenous federation in Ecuador and has been responsible for much of the militant resistance to right-wing governments in Ecuador, but unfortunately has also swayed in its political spectrum over the years, sometimes siding with Washington interests. And there are what is true of them, and very similar to like unions in the United States, right, where the leadership can be right wing, where the leadership can be bureaucratic, right? We saw what's his name, O'Brien of the Teamsters. He met with Trump, right? There's also union bureaucrats who meet with the Democrats and the DNC, responsible for genocide and the exploitation of workers internally. And we see these union bureaucrats sell out their workers so many times. But I want to say to American workers, they don't have to represent you. You do not have to be accountable to them. You can have militant rank and file rebellions. You can resist them. And the Ecuadorian people did when CONAI didn't put a democratic, decision about ending the strike, when they just announced it over social media without even giving their militant rank and file bases an opportunity to speak. These militant groups came forward in the hundreds across the country and held public, press conferences and said, no, we workers, we campesinos, we students, we're not represented by this decision, and the strike continues. And so, yeah, I think those are some of the lessons that we can learn. And the other thing I'll just say um, and Black Alliance for Peace and the Zona de Paz are doing this work, but it's internationalist coordination, right? We cannot rely on only our nation's liberation struggle. We have to be coordinated because the bourgeoisie of our nations are, and so the working class of our nations must be too.
Bars, 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 and bars.
Thank you.
Internationalism, always. Yeah. I'm curious if we can talk a little bit more about this split, I guess, if you will, in the leadership of CONAI and in the mass space of CONAI. Right. Because I remember, right, 4 minutes, we'll give you 4 minutes. Right. I remember, right, Marlon Vargas coming out saying that, very unfortunately we have to make this decision to end this strike. And then later that day, folks I think it was Imbabura, that were saying absolutely not. That was not popularly consulted. We still uphold the strike. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit more to maybe the class antagonisms within the leadership and the broader base, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I'll try to be quick because it sounds like we're down to the minute. But I think in a more general sense, yes, I think this is often also a representative of a larger pattern of professional organizers and their contradiction with then working class people who are involved in militant organizing struggle. And in general, there have been times where CONAI, I had mentioned, for example, they ran Yacu Perez, who's was an indigenous man of Cañar, who had legitimate criticisms of the former government of Correa. That was a democratic socialist government which had cut poverty in half, which had, the highest wages, a minimum wage in all of Latin America during his time. He ousted the U.S. military bases. He expropriated a ton of our industries. He seized the central bank. He democratized media that was formerly all owned by corporate banks, and so he did a lot of progress for our nation. And also there were shortcomings that he had, particularly that most impacted indigenous working class groups. And as a result of that, there are members within CONAI who are very critical of him, and with all good reason. But we were faced an election between a right wing banker who was responsible for the 1990s economic crash, in which over 60% of Ecuadorians lost all their savings. Right, many of them lost their homes, and a democratic socialist who was promising universal health care, reinstating the nationalization of several industries, promising $1,000 checks, which goes a long way in Ecuador to working class families. And in that, CONAI decided to, or I should say, a specific sector of CONAI, the Pachacutic party in particular, decided to run a candidate who was managed by his wife, Manuela Pic, who has worked for the Republican government of Florida, who was a member of the FTAA, the Trade Agreements Association that excludes Cuba and that is part of the embargo on Cuba. Who during the coup of Evo Morales was, while the US was invading Bolivia or supporting the invasion of Bolivia by right-wing forces and massacring indigenous people in the Sencata region, she gets on national TV and starts criticizing Evo Morales as a misogynist and just wielding, not a true anti-patriarchal position, but more of a bourgeois feminist critique. And so and also Yacu Perez himself, he said, I would prefer a banker over a dictator, which all communists know is a very common slander that U.S. State Department uses against these folks. And in response to this campaign, actually many folks criticized the presidential campaign of Yacu Perez within CONAI itself, right? And so CONAI is, and one of them actually was Leonidas Issa, who warned that there were right-wing forces within Yacu Perez's campaign. And I just want to say that, Leonidas Issa represents, he is one of the leaders of the two successful general strikes in Ecuador, and he represents a militant anti-imperialist and, campesino movement that is accountable to the indigenous workers of Ecuador. And so there's these two sides of CONAI, and I think it's because it is primarily an identity-based organization. And I don't say that disparagingly, it's just the reality is that it's around indigenous people, and there are various different class positions amongst the indigenous people of Ecuador. And it's very similar to the United States. It's kind of like a federation based on I would say the most equivalent to the United States is like tribal law. So you have bourgeois indigenous people who are like, we'll protect our lands from the more mestizo government, but we will not interrogate the class contradictions between the bourgeois indigenous people and the working class indigenous people. And you see those really come to a head in militant movements like a general strike. Like in those moments where everything is on the line, you see who sells out the quickest. And just like within mestizo and white communities, the same is true within marginalized ethnicities like indigenous people, where those class contradictions, it's always the bourgeoisie or the petty bourgeois who are the first to sell out. So sorry, I know that was quick, and I hope I was concise.
No, thank you so, so much. That was perfect. Thank you for coming on and sharing so much, honestly. We